Llywelyn the Great, full name Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, was a Prince of Gwynedd in North Wales and eventually de facto ruler over most of Wales. By a combination of war and diplomacy, he dominated Wales for 40 years. During Llywelyn's boyhood, Gwynedd was ruled by two of his uncles, who split the kingdom between them. Following the death of Llywelyn's grandfather, Owain Gwynedd, in 1170, Llywelyn had a strong claim to be the legitimate ruler and began a campaign to win power at an early age. He was sole ruler of Gwynedd by 1200 and made a treaty with King John of England that year. Llywelyn's relations with John remained good for the next 10 years. He married John's natural daughter Joan in 1205, and when John arrested Llywelyn ap Owain of power in 1208, Llywelyn took the opportunity to annex southern Powys. In 1210, relations deteriorated, and John invaded Gwynedd in 1211. Llywelyn was forced to seek terms and to give up all lands west of the River Conwy, but was able to recover them the following year in alliance with the other Welsh princes. He allied himself with the barons who forced John to sign Magna Carta in 1215. By 1216, he was the dominant power in Wales, holding a council at Aberdyfi that year to apportion lands to the other princes. Following King John's death, Llywelyn concluded the Treaty of Worcester with his successor, Henry III, in 1218. During the next 15 years, Llywelyn was frequently involved in fights with marcher lords and sometimes with the king, but also made alliances with several major powers in the Marches. The Peace of Middle in 1234 marked the end of Llywelyn's military career, as the agreed truce of 2 years was extended year by year for the remainder of his reign. He maintained his position in Wales until his death in 1240 and was succeeded by his son Dafydd ap Llywelyn. Genealogy in early life. Llywelyn was born about 1173, the son of Iorwerth ap Owain and the grandson of Owain Gwynedd, who had been ruler of Gwynedd until his death in 1170. Llywelyn was a descendant of the senior line of Rhodri Mawr and therefore a member of the princely house of Gwynedd. He was probably born at Llywelyn, though not in the present Llywelyn castle, which was built by Llywelyn himself. He may have been born in the old castle, which occupied a rocky knoll on the valley floor. Little is known about his father, Iorwerth, who died when Llywelyn was an infant. There is no record of Iorwerth having taken part in the power struggle between some of Owain Gwynedd's other sons following Owain's death, although he was the eldest surviving son. There is a tradition that he was disabled or disfigured in some way that excluded him from power. By 1175, Gwynedd had been divided between two of Llywelyn's uncles. Dafydd ap Owain held the area east of the River Conwy and Rhodri ap Owain held the west. Dafydd and Rhodri were the sons of Owain by his second marriage to Christine Verchgorenwy. This marriage was not considered valid by the church as Christine was Owain's first cousin, a degree of relationship which according to canon law prohibited marriage. Giraldus Cambrensis refers to Iorwerth as the only legitimate son of Owain Gwynedd. Following Iorwerth's death, Llywelyn was, at least in the eyes of the church, the legitimate claimant to the throne of Gwynedd. Llywelyn's mother was married, occasionally anglicised, to Margaret, daughter of Madog ap Maredudd, Prince of Powys. There is evidence that, after her first husband's death, Maredudd married in the summer of 1197 Gwaun, the nephew of Roger Powys of Whittington Castle, with whom she had a son, David ap Gwaun. Therefore, some maintain that Maredudd never married into the Corbett family of Cowes Castle and later later, Morton Corbett Castle. However, there is in existence a grant of land from Llywelyn ab Iorwerth to the monastery of Wigmore, in which Llywelyn indicates his mother was a member of the House of Corbett, leaving the issue unresolved. Rise to power 1188 to 1199. In his account of his journey around Wales in 1188, Giraldus Cambrensis mentions that the young Llywelyn was already in arms against his uncles Dafydd and Rhodri. Owain, son of Gruffydd, Prince of North Wales, had many sons, but only one legitimate, namely, Llywelyn Drindone, which in Welsh means flat-nosed, who had a son named Llywelyn. This young man, being only 12 years of age, began, during the period of our journey, to molest his uncles David and Roderick, the sons of Owain by Christiana, his cousin german, and although they had divided amongst themselves all North Wales, except the land of Conan, and although David, having married the sister of King Henry II, by whom he had one son, was powerfully supported by the English, yet within a few years the legitimate son, destitute of lands or money, bravely expelled from North Wales those who were born in public incest, though supported by their own wealth and by that of others, leaving them nothing but what the liberality of his own mind and the counsel of good men from pity suggested, a proof that adulterous and incestuous persons are displeasing to God. In 1194, with the aid of his cousins Gruffydd ap Cynan and Maredudd ap Cynan, he defeated Dafydd at the Battle of Aberconwy at the mouth of the River Conwy. Rhodri died in 1195, and his lands west of the Conwy were taken over by Gruffydd and Maredudd, while Llywelyn ruled the territories taken from Dafydd east of the Conwy. In 1197 Llywelyn captured Dafydd and imprisoned him. A year later, Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, persuaded Llywelyn to release him, and Dafydd retired to England, where he died in May 1203. Wales was divided into Pwllheli, the areas ruled by the Welsh princes, and Marchiawalla, ruled by the Anglo-Norman barons. Since the death of Owain Gwynedd in 1170, Rhys ap Gruffydd had made the southern kingdom of Llywelyn the strongest of the Welsh kingdoms, and had established himself as the leader of Pwllheli. After Rhys died in 1197, fighting between his sons led to the splitting of Llywelyn between warring factions. Gwynedd ab Owain, Prince of Powys, Gwynedd tried to take over as leader of the Welsh princes, and in 1198 raised a great army to besiege Payne's Castle, which was held by the troops of William de Braose, Lord of Bramber. Llywelyn sent troops to help Gwynedd, but in August Gwyned's force was attacked by an army led by the justiciar, Geoffrey Fitzpeter, and heavily defeated. Gwyned's defeat gave Llywelyn the opportunity to establish himself as the leader of the Welsh. In 1199 he captured the important castle of Mold and was apparently using the title Prince of the whole of North Wales. Llywelyn was probably not in fact master of all Gwynedd at this time, since it was his cousin Gruffydd ap Cynan who promised homage to King John IV. Gwynedd in 1199. Reign as Prince of Gwynedd. Consolidation 1200 to 1209. Gruffydd ap Cynan died in 1200 and left Llywelyn the undisputed ruler of Gwynedd. In 1201 he took Iorwerth and Lynn from Maredudd ap Cynan on a charge of treachery. In July the same year Llywelyn concluded a treaty with King John of England. This is the earliest surviving written agreement between an English king and a Welsh ruler, and under its terms Llywelyn was to swear fealty and homage to the king. In return, it confirmed Llywelyn's possession of his conquests and allowed cases relating to lands claimed by Llywelyn to be heard under Welsh law. Llywelyn made his first move beyond the borders of Gwynedd in August 1202 when he raised a force to attack Gwynedd ab Owain of Powys, who was now his main rival in Wales. The clergy intervened to make peace between Llywelyn and Gwynedd, and the invasion was called off. At least Ap Madog, Lord of Penclin, had refused to respond to Llywelyn's summons to arms and was stripped of almost all his lands by Llywelyn as punishment. Llywelyn consolidated his position in 1205 by marrying Joan, the natural daughter of King John. He had previously been negotiating with Pope Innocent III for leave to marry his uncle Rodri's widow, daughter of Ronval de Guthrothausen, King of the Isles. However, this proposal was dropped. In 1208, Gwynedd of Powys fell out with King John, who summoned him to Shrewsbury in October and then arrested him and stripped him of his lands. Llywelyn took the opportunity to annex southern Powys and northern Ceredigion and rebuild Aberystwyth Castle. In the summer of 1209 he accompanied John on a campaign against King William I of Scotland. In 1210 relations between Llywelyn and King John deteriorated. J. Lloyd suggests that the rupture may have been due to Llywelyn forming an alliance with William de Braose, 4th Lord of Bramber, who had fallen out with the king and had been deprived of his lands. While John led a campaign against de Braose and his allies in Ireland, an army led by Earl Ranulph of Chester and Peter des Roches, Bishop of Winchester, invaded Gwynedd. Llywelyn destroyed his own castle at Deganwy and retreated west of the River Conwy. The Earl of Chester rebuilt Deganwy, and Llywelyn retaliated by ravaging the Earl's lands. John sent troops to help restore Gwynedd to the rule of southern Powys. In 1211 John invaded Gwynedd with the aid of almost all the other Welsh princes, planning according to Brut White a Wisegwyn to dispossess Llywelyn and destroy him utterly. The first invasion was forced to retreat, but in August that year John invaded again with a larger army, crossed the River Conwy and penetrated Snowdonia. Bangor was burnt by a detachment of the royal army and the Bishop of Bangor captured. Llywelyn was forced to come to terms, and by the advice of his council sent his wife Joan to negotiate with the king, her father. Joan was able to persuade her father not to dispossess her husband completely, but Llywelyn lost all his lands west of the River Conwy. He also had to pay a large tribute in cattle and horses and to hand over hostages, including his illegitimate son Griffith, and was forced to agree that if he died without a legitimate heir by Joan, all his lands would revert to the king. This was the low point of Llywelyn's reign, but he quickly recovered his position. The other Welsh princes, who had supported King John against Llywelyn, soon became disillusioned with John's rule and changed sides. Llywelyn formed an alliance with Gwynedd of Powys and the two main rulers of Deheubarth, Maelgwn ap Rhys and Rhys Gyg, and rose against John. They had the support of Pope Innocent III, who had been engaged in a dispute with John for several years and had placed his kingdom under an interdict. Innocent released Llywelyn, Gwynedd and Maelgwn from all oaths of loyalty to John and lifted the interdict in the territories which they controlled. Llywelyn was able to recover all Gwynedd apart from the castles of Deganwy and Rhuddlan within 2 months in 1212. John planned another invasion of Gwynedd in August 1212. According to one account, he had just commenced by hanging some of the Welsh hostages given the previous year when he received 2 letters. One was from his daughter Joan, Llywelyn's wife, the other from William I of Scotland, and both warned him in similar terms that if he invaded Wales his magnates would seize the opportunity to kill him or hand him over to his enemies. The invasion was abandoned, and in 1213 Llywelyn took the castles of Deganwy and Rhuddlan. Llywelyn made an alliance with Philip II Augustus of France, then allied himself with the barons who were in rebellion against John, marching on Shrewsbury and capturing it without resistance in 1215. When John was forced to sign Magna Carta, Llywelyn was rewarded with several favourable provisions relating to Wales, including the release of his son Griffith, who had been a hostage since 1211. The same year Ednyfed Fichan was appointed Seneschal of Gwynedd and was to work closely with Llywelyn for the remainder of his reign. Llywelyn had now established himself as the leader of the independent princes of Wales, and in December 1215 led an army which included all the lesser princes to capture the castles of Carmarthen, Cadwally, Llanstefan, Cardigan and Cilgerran. Another indication of his growing power was that he was able to insist on the consecration of Welshmen to two vacant sees that year: Iorwerth as Bishop of St. David's and Cadogan as Bishop of Bangor. In 1216, Llywelyn held a council at Aberdyfi to adjudicate on the territorial claims of the lesser princes, who affirmed the homage and allegiance to Llywelyn. Beverley Smith comments, henceforth, the leader would be lord, and the allies would be subjects. Llywelyn of Powys changed sides again that year and allied himself with King John. Llywelyn called up the other princes for a campaign against him and drove him out of southern Powys once more. Llywelyn died in England later that year, leaving an underage heir. King John also died that year, and he also left an underage heir in King Henry III, with a minority government set up in England. In 1217, Reginald de Bres of Brecon and Abergavenny, who had been allied to Llywelyn and married his daughter, Gladys the, was induced by the English crown to change sides. Llywelyn responded by invading his lands, first threatening Brecon, where the burgesses offered hostages for the payment of 100 marks, then heading for Swansea, where Reginald de Bres met him to offer submission and to surrender the town. He then continued westwards to threaten Haverfordwest, where the burgesses offered hostages for the submission to his rule of the payment of a fine of 1,000 marks. Following King John's death, Llywelyn concluded the Treaty of Worcester with his successor Henry III in 1218. This treaty confirmed him in possession of all his recent conquests. For then until his death, Llywelyn was the dominant force in Wales, though there were further outbreaks of hostilities with Marcher lords, particularly the Marshall family and Hubert de Burgh, and sometimes with the king. Llywelyn built up marriage alliances with several of the Marcher families. One daughter, Gladys the, was already married to Reginald de Bres of Brecon and Abergavenny, but with Reginald and unreliable ally Llywelyn married another daughter, married to John de Bres of Gower, Reginald's nephew. He found a loyal ally in Ranulph, Earl of Chester, whose nephew and heir, John the Scot, married Llywelyn's daughter Elyn in about 1222. Following Reginald de Breos's death in 1228, Llywelyn also made an alliance with the powerful Mortimer family of Wigmore when Gladys the married as her second husband Ralph de Mortimer. Llywelyn was careful not to provoke unnecessary hostilities with the crown of the Marcher lords. For example, in 1220 he compelled Rhys Gryg to return 4 comotes in South Wales to the previous Anglo-Norman owners. He built a number of castles to defend his borders, most thought to have been built between 1220 and 1230. These were the first sophisticated stone castles in Wales. His castles at Criccieth, Deganwy, Dolbadarn, Dolweddelyn and Castellwybr are among the best examples. Llywelyn also appears to have fostered the development of quasi-urban settlements in Gwynedd to act as centres of trade. Hostilities broke out with William Marshall, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, in 1220. Llywelyn destroyed the castles of Narberth and Wyston, burned the town of Haverfordwest and threatened Pembroke Castle, but agreed to abandon the attack on payment of £100. In early 1223 Llywelyn crossed the border into Shropshire and captured Kinnerley and Whittington castles. The marshals took advantage of Llywelyn's involvement here to land near St David's in April with an army raised in Ireland and recaptured Cardigan and Carmarthen without opposition. The Marshals' campaign was supported by a royal army which took possession of Montgomery. Llywelyn came to an agreement with the king at Montgomery in October that year. Llywelyn's allies in South Wales were given back lands taken from them by the Marshals, and Llywelyn himself gave up his conquests in Shropshire. In 1228 Llywelyn was engaged in a campaign against Hubert de Burgh, who was Justiciar of England and Ireland and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Hubert had been given the lordship and castle of Montgomery by the king and was encroaching on Llywelyn's lands nearby. The king raised an army to help Hubert, who began to build another castle in the Comote of Kerry. However, in October the royal army was obliged to retreat and Henry agreed to destroy the half-built castle in exchange for the payment of £2,000 Llywelyn raised the money by demanding the same sum as the ransom of William de Braose, Lord of Abergavenny, whom he had captured in the fighting. Following his capture, William de Braose decided to ally himself to Llywelyn, and a marriage was arranged between his daughter Isabella and Llywelyn's heir, Dafydd ap Llywelyn. At Easter 1230 William visited Llywelyn's court. During this visit he was found in Llywelyn's chamber together with Llywelyn's wife Joan. On the 2nd of May, de Braose was hanged. Joan was placed under house arrest for a year. The brute white Llywelyn chronicler commented, that year William de Braose the Younger, Lord of Brackenhog, was hanged by the Lord Llywelyn in Gwynedd, after he had been caught in Llywelyn's chamber with the King of England's daughter, Llywelyn's wife. A letter from Llywelyn to William's wife, Eva de Braose, written shortly after the execution, inquires whether she still wishes the marriage between Dafydd and Isabella to take place. The marriage did go ahead, and the following year Joan was forgiven and restored to her position as princess. Until 1230 Llywelyn had used the title Princeps Norwalii, Prince of North Waleses, but from that year he changed his title to Prince of North Wales and Lord of Snowdonia, possibly to underline his supremacy over the other Welsh princes. He did not formally style himself Prince of Wales, although, as J. E. Lloyd comments, he had much of the power which such a title might imply. In 1231 there was further fighting. Llywelyn was becoming concerned about the growing power of Hubert de Burgh. Some of his men had been taken prisoner by the garrison of Montgomery and beheaded, and Llywelyn responded by burning Montgomery, Powys, New Radnor, Hay and Brecon before turning west to capture the castles of Neath and Cadwally. He completed the campaign by recapturing Cardigan Castle. King Henry retaliated by launching an invasion and built a new castle at Paynes Castle, but was unable to penetrate far into Wales. Negotiations continued into 1232, when Hubert was removed from office and later imprisoned. Much of his power passed to Peter de Rivo, including control of several castles in South Wales. William Marshal had died in 1231, and his brother Richard had succeeded him as Earl of Pembroke. In 1233 hostilities broke out between Richard Marshal and Peter de Rivo, who was supported by the king. Llywelyn made an alliance with Richard, and in January 1234 the Earl and Llywelyn seized Shrewsbury. Richard was killed in Ireland in April, but the king agreed to make peace with the insurgents. The Peace of Middle, agreed on the 21st of June, established a truce of 2 years with Llywelyn, who was allowed to retain Cardigan and Bwil. This truce was renewed year by year from the remainder of Llywelyn's reign.